Welcome to Film Dialogue, a new movie program on Horizon Television that brings you award-winning films from the world of independent cinema. My name is Alex Colagnamos, the director of ARPA International Film Festival, and this year marks the 15th anniversary of presenting Armenian cinema in Los Angeles. And now, exclusively on Horizon Television and Film Dialogue, we'll be presenting the best films from past festivals. Tonight's feature presentation is the award-winning documentary Screamers, directed by Carla Garabedian, the 2007 recipient of our film festival's Armin T. Wegner Award. And Carla will be joining us shortly, exclusively here on Film Dialogue.
Why?
Because the porch needs some work.
Why?
Because plants need water to grow.
Why?
Because baseball's played in the summer. Oxygen and hydrogen. Gravity. Because that's just the shape of my head. Because monkeys don't get married. It's complicated. Because I forgot to get a receipt. I don't know.
Why?
Why not?
Why?
Why don't you go ask your dad?
Why?
When you drive a Sonata, people might think you know something they don't. The Sonata from Hyundai.
Your body is the force that guides you through each day, but having a vein disorder can be both embarrassing and debilitating. It's time to take control of your life again. At Vena Vascular Lab and Vein Clinic, we'll help you on your path towards recovery. Our practice is built on the principle of exceptional patient care, and we work tirelessly to find the best treatment options for each individual person. We won't give up until your needs are met. Vena Vascular Lab and Vein Clinic. Vein care beneath the surface.
The memory of a new beginning. The memory of joyous homecoming. The memory of a life of togetherness. The memory of leaving home behind. The memory of the first morsel. That's why we cultivate every grain with special care. Dawat Basmati. Not just a meal, it's a memory.
In the heart of Glendale on Brand Boulevard, you can find a unique and authentic Brazilian restaurant. We serve all-you-can-eat barbecue, 25 different kinds of meat grilled over open fire. The choice is yours. Our buffet and salad bar will amaze you. Don't miss out on live entertainment shows every Friday and Saturday nights straight from Rio de Janeiro. And now open Hollywood Hookah Lounge. Enjoy full bar, smoking area, and full menu. Reserve now for your personal or corporate events. Get 20% off when you mention this ad. Great service, unmatched entertainment, and beautiful atmosphere. Only at Gaucho's Village.
Why do people call you uncle?
Everybody needs an uncle. You're providing for your family. This is what makes a real man.
I think your father has the potential of becoming a TV star.
I'm also his manager.
What would you say if I asked you to be an uncle for television?
This September,
this may be God's plan for you, Raphael.
when a modern American family gets an uncle from the old country.
This whole country's uncle.
Really?
Yes.
No.
America, say uncle.
Ow! Stop slapping!
My Uncle Raphael.
Do I look scary?
In selected theaters September 21st.
Hummingbird.
What hummingbird?
My mistake.
Սեպտեմբեր 21-ից Նյու Յորքի, Թորոնտոյի եւ Կալիֆոռնիայի կինոթատրոններում, Ֆրեզնոում Regal Manchester 16, Գլենդելում Ամերիկանա, Burbank, AMC, նույնպես Orange County, Irvine եւ San Diego։ Տեղեկությունների համար այցելեք myuncleraphael.com։
Ask a Kia Optima owner why they love their car, and they might say it's the voice-activated infotainment system, the heated and cooled seats, the panoramic sunroof, the 35 mpg. Or they might just say, hold on tight, muchacho. The new 274 horsepower turbocharged Kia Optima, not your average midsize sedan.
And we're joined with Carla Garabedian. Thank you so much for joining us on Film Dialogue here today. We know
it's great to be here.
It's very exciting. A film show dedicated to discovering more about the filmmakers whose films we truly treasure. So tell us, what is your ancestral background? Where is your family from?
Well, my family came from Armenia. One side came from Sivas, Sepastia, and the other side came from Van and Salmas. So from both sides, both parents are Armenian. My grandparents on both sides were Armenian. One side came to America after the Armenian genocide, and one side came to America after the Hamidian massacres in the 1894 to 1896 period.
That's right.
So, so I'm a grandchild of genocide survivors.
And where did they settle when they came? They came to America.
They came to America to Ellis Island, through Ellis Island, and just the whole decision about whether to allow them in or not was very dramatic. And at one point, it looked like they were going to have to turn back and go back to Constantinople because my aunt had some kind of skin problem, and you could just on the turn of a dime be sent back.
Was that even an option to go back to Constantinople?
You had no choice. If they rejected you, you had to go back. But luckily they were passed, as it were, and they went to Ohio, where there were no Armenians. This is in something like 1921. And, but their sponsors were in Ohio, and my grandfather started a tailor's shop, a cleaning shop and a tailor's shop, and that was the beginning of their life in America. Eventually, they made their way to California. And on the other side, they settled in Oregon and eventually moved down to Los Angeles.
I think everyone sort of ends up, it's the same with my family. They ended up, my mom and dad met right here in Hollywood.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's interesting. And then when they settled here, were you raised in Los Angeles?
I was raised in North Hollywood.
North Hollywood.
And the Armenian church in Van Nuys was the focal point for community in the San Fernando Valley. So I went to St. Peter's Armenian Church and went to Armenian school, the whole deal. Although I'm not fluent, I did try. And it was a very cohesive community in the 60s and 70s, growing up in the San Fernando Valley. Very conscious of our Armenian culture. The church was the gathering point. Even if you weren't particularly religious, it was the gathering point for Armenians in the community, and that's where you met a lot of young people, and your hopes and aspirations came from that community.
And when did you express to your community that well, actually you have a journalistic background. You were an anchor on the world news for the BBC. How did that happen? And at what point did you tell your family that you want to go into entertainment?
Well, it's a good question, because initially I wanted to travel the world, and I didn't really have a clear idea of where exactly I should go. I was limited by the fact that I did not speak a foreign language. So I couldn't go to Spain and study. Even though I had some Spanish, I wouldn't be good enough to go to university there. Obviously my English was good enough, so I decided if I could, I would go to university in Britain. Initially I went for a year, and then I did my entire undergraduate degree there and ultimately my postgraduate degree there. So I, from 1979, was a resident in London, and was full-time a resident of London up to 2007. And I still have my flat there in London. I'm a British citizen now. So I feel an allegiance both as a European citizen and as an American citizen. And it's interesting to be both, because you can see things from both sides of both points of view.
Such as?
I think when it comes to, for example, the politics now in the presidential campaign, you'll often hear people talking about Europe and the policies of Europe, and having lived there, I obviously feel very, patriotic about the services that were provided in London, and but on the other hand, as an American, I can see what preoccupies Americans. So I straddle both cultures.
And you were, of course, supported by the BBC in your first filmmaking endeavors. How did that happen? You made the transition from a journalist and an anchor to filmmaking. Did it start on the job, or did it happen after?
I actually was in the last year of my PhD research, and I was approached by a television documentary company. They wanted somebody who had the research expertise that I had. It just so happened I specialized in European defense policy, which sounds more exciting than it actually was. But in any case, they wanted somebody with that background. And that's how I got to make or be involved in my first television documentary as a researcher. And when I finished that, these producers, they said, when you're ready to start working in television full time, come back to us and we'll help you get a job. And that was an amazing opening, because it's a very competitive, as it is here, a very competitive industry. To get your foot in the door in television, especially in documentaries, which it seems everybody wants to work in, very difficult. And sure enough, they got me my first job, and I didn't look back. In 1987, I got my first job, and I made my first documentary in 1988, and it was nominated for a Royal Television Society Award. So I knew that there must be something I was doing right. And many years later, I then came back to the United States with a BBC co-production, and that was Screamers.
That was Screamers. Well, I can't wait to talk to you about Screamers. It's one of our favorite films, my favorite films. It was an Armentee Award winner at the ARPA Film Festival. There was a time, though, in your career where you were making films and documentaries, and you were actually going undercover. You've filmed documentaries about Korea, Afghanistan, Iran. Is that possible for you anymore? And can you talk a little bit about what that was like?
I think I've been very fortunate to have bridged the technological revolution of television and documentary filmmaking, and we're still in a technological revolution with people being able to film, Arab, Egyptian revolution with their phones. I mean, that's where we are right now. When I started out, it was just the end of the film era where news was recorded on film cameras, and you would then have to transport that film to the news studios with motorcycles and physically transport the film. I was just at the end of that period when electronic news gathering, video cameras started to come into play, and that made it possible to be very mobile. But you still needed these big hulking cameramen to hold those, those big Beta cameras on their shoulders. And those cameras, while they allowed you to be more mobile and go around and film things, very easily, they still were very intrusive to the people that you were interviewing. The big change came at I would say the millennium, where very small cameras with high quality chips could record images of broadcast quality. And what that meant was you could go into a country which did not allow journalists at all to enter, a country like North Korea, for example, and take essentially what looks like a tourist camera. And it would be a camera of such quality that you could take pictures that could be shown on television. That fundamentally changed the way that we worked. And it meant that journalists, often at great risk, and you might say stupidity, would go into these places that forbade them from filming, and be able to interview people and show things that were happening, often abuses of human rights, talk to people who were being persecuted. For example, I produced a program about Iran, the student movement in Iran, the dissident movement, and the reporter was traveling undercover as a tourist And she was meeting dissidents along the way, along her tourist trip, meeting her in Isfahan, meeting her in Tabriz, meeting her in Tehran. Ostensibly she was a tourist, but really she was recording those interviews with a very small camera. So that changed the whole way that documentaries were made. And now we're in this period where anybody can, whether they hold up a phone or whether it's their iPad or whatever it may be, can be a citizen filmmaker, if you want to call it that. And they can record what they see. They can record their participation in the news. So it's a very subjective way of filming. So you see people in Egypt who are fighting for their lives being attacked, and they're holding up their phones, and they themselves are under attack.
That's right.
And I think that we don't really know where this is going, because on the one hand, it's good that we have this perspective. On the other hand, what's going to happen to the more traditional objective way of filming? Are we going to have a place for the reporter in the future? So all that, has to be determined, and so I'm just watching it and wondering, what's going to happen next.
That's so interesting. The concept of a citizen filmmaker, that in itself, that could change the world. Like in countries where we see revolutions taking place, and everyone has a camera. I know you always had it in your mind to do a film about your culture, about Armenia, but you waited, and you waited very carefully, and meanwhile you were making all of these other amazing documentaries about other nations. When did it happen so all of this technology kind of brought you to this place where you'd be making like a huge documentary, a concert film, which is what Screamers is. It's a documentary, it's a rockumentary.
Yes. Well, I have to say, I very reluctantly made the decision, and I was reluctant for two reasons. One was I knew and was mentored by a very accomplished Armenian documentary filmmaker, J. Michael Hagopian, who was a friend of my father's, and I grew up with him as my idol. And I saw how difficult it was to make a film about the Armenian genocide, because there are very few pictures. And you really need eyewitness accounts, and Michael filmed eyewitnesses from the mid-60s all the way to 2005. But that said, it was still very difficult to tell the story, and I didn't really see how I could add anything. I was making more political documentaries of a contemporary nature. I didn't really see what I could do. What changed that was coming into contact with System of a Down, and the BBC, very traditional news organization, being interested in the Armenian question in the 2004-2005 period. And the reason they were interested in it was because Turkey was applying for membership of the European community. And one of the issues holding that membership back, there were a lot of issues, but one of them was Turkey's civil rights or lack of civil rights, and its treatment of the Armenians, the whole genocide issue, and whether Turkey would recognize it or not. So suddenly history was intruding on contemporary politics, and the BBC decided, hey, here's an opportunity to make a film about this historical issue in a contemporary context, using these four angry young men and their world tour. I proposed to them that we use System of a Down and their world tour. They were going on tour in 2005 all over the world, and to use their concert tour as a narrative device to tell a historical narrative about not just the Armenian genocide, but all of the major genocides in the 20th century.
Which they explore in their lyrics.
Yes.
They very much address not only the Armenian genocide, but the Holocaust in Darfur and Rwanda.
That's right. And they made that a precondition of my making the film. They didn't want the film to just be about the Armenian genocide. And at the same time, Samantha Power had written a Pulitzer Prize-winning book about genocide in the 20th century. And she argued that the Armenian genocide was a template for the way Western European and America reacted and dealt with genocide in the 20th century. The fact that they often would not intervene. They would say that they would do something about genocide, but in fact, in practice, they did very little. And so she used the Armenian genocide as a template, and the BBC was interested in that. They said, could you explore Samantha Power's thesis? So I actually had a lot on my plate. And the worst of it for me was I had never listened to heavy metal music growing up, like a lot of young people. I missed that somehow. And listening for the first time to System of a Down, I just thought, oh my God, what am I gonna do? I don't have the ear for this music. I don't understand why they're screaming. I don't understand what they're about. And I panicked. And it was an interesting education, going to their concerts, listening to the music, and slowly, like a record that has grooves put in it, I slowly got the ear. And central to that was Serj Tankian's voice, that voice which is like, the Derhar singing in church.
Right.
You hear the tenor of it, it takes you to a place far away, and that's what grabbed me. His voice and also his demeanor when I met him.
And so when you went on tour, the tour was an American tour, it was a European tour. How long were you on the road with them, getting to know them and work with them? Their interviews, your interview footage of them, especially Shavo, I mean, incredible. It's poignant, it's funny, it's warm.
I actually didn't have that much time with them on the bus, and so I had to pack a lot in a short time. I would drop in and see them at various concerts, but actually doing those interviews was recorded over a 3-day period. And they had 2 big buses. Serj had a bus, and no, actually, Serj was flying, Darren had a bus, and Shavo and John had a bus. So there were 2 buses and Serj was flying. So I would sort of go between the buses, and actually the interview with Darren Malakian was done in the middle of the night. And that's another thing that one has to become accustomed to, are the hours of these guys, because they
don't sleep.
They do these concerts, and then they're really wired because all the adrenaline that goes into it. And they don't, it's not like they go back to their hotel and go to sleep, because they're wired. So they're often going to sleep at like 2:33 in the morning.
And creative, and probably wanting to make music and write and do all of that.
Well, it's just a weird life. And then they sleep until noon, and they have breakfast at lunchtime. And so if you're trying to sort of trail that, it's a kind of wild and crazy trip. But I did learn a lot from them, and I really respect the energy and the level of professionalism that it takes to do that kind of work, because they would be pulling off hour-and-a-half sets without a stop. They're performing one song after the other, and it's not like they're talking in between songs or interacting with the audience. It's just straight performance, speed metal.
That's right.
Giving it everything you've got.
That's right. That's right. So this amazing confluence of things came together for you as a filmmaker, but I think also for the band, because they were visiting DC, they were speaking out, and you were able to film all of that. As a filmmaker, what is it like? You're thrown into these situations, you have your crew, you're coming from a background where you got into war zones, I'm sure very equipped for that. But this is a little different, because it's an issue that people are, it's a controversial issue. It really shouldn't be, but we're here trying to fight for the recognition. And so, can you talk a little bit about how that is to negotiate some of those scenes?
Well, I will say that my experience in Britain, I was making documentaries from 1987 to something like 2005, and the last film I made before Screamers was a film about mercenaries in Africa. And so it was a really difficult film, and I really had to work very hard to get the scenes that I wanted in that film. So I came into Screamers with my director's hat on very firmly, and I don't think those guys had any idea how bossy I was going to be. And I had to do it in a nice way, and they were very tolerant. And I think they treated me as an Armenian relative that they had to tolerate. And, but from my point of view, I knew that my time with them was limited, and also telling the story in that way, which was, you're on a concert tour, but you're on a historical tour. It's a very metaphorical way to make a history film, and so you have to be really focused in what you're trying to get. and you have to manipulate people in a way that they don't know they're being manipulated, but as a director, that's what you have to do.
Right.
That's the job. And at one point, I felt I was definitely pushing the line of, you can't be friends with the people who are the objects of your documentary, the subjects of your documentary. You want to be their friend, but if you have to choose between being a friend and being a director, you have to be the director. So I think there were certainly times where they just looked over and just thought, oh no, it's her again. It's Carla, you know, there's that camera again. But I was chasing Dennis Hastert, who was then the Speaker of the House, and I was trying to get him to answer the question why he was not allowing a vote on the Armenian Genocide resolution in the House, and it was very important for the film that we got his answer, because there was the allegation by one of the contributors of our film that he was blocking it because there were conflicts of interest and various business interests who were pressuring him to not allow a vote. So I was trying to get him on camera, and just by accident, Serge and John were walking through Congress at the day that we were filming there. They wanted to get some cigarettes from the shop in Congress, and they happened to bump into Dennis Hastert in the central rotunda of the the main building. Wow. And it was one of these moments where luckily they had a cameraman with them, that was very fortunate. It wasn't me, but they had their own band cameraman, and they caught this encounter. And Serge had the guts, I can't say, because it takes a lot of guts to put a question to such a powerful political figure, totally out of the blue, when you're not really tuned into it. He had the guts to ask the question to Dennis Hastert, when are you going to allow a vote on the Armenian Genocide? And he asked it in a very polite way. I have to say, if it had been me, I would have been a lot more pushy, and I wouldn't have been as nice. Right. But Serge had a very polite, gentlemanly way of answering the question, and we got that sequence. So things like that happen, and when you're making films, especially documentaries, you have to be prepared, and luckily that worked out.
That was an incredible scene in the film. I remember feeling a trepidation, and like my heart was having palpitations, wondering how he was going to phrase it. He was very gutsy, but you're right, he was an absolute gentleman.
Yes.
In the way that he spoke to him. You talk about some of the more memorable times you had shooting. You remember the day where you were interviewing Susan Power, and it was like a beautiful day. You were by the river talking about the most difficult subject, and that was, for you at this point, you're on production, you're talking about the genocide every single day. What was that like? How do you keep yourself so focused without getting caught into the emotional drain?
I think I was trained in covering human rights abuses in war zones and countries where you just have such dire circumstances, the people you're interviewing, that you become hardened to it. Occasionally, especially when it comes to the Armenian Genocide, anything to do with children and stories about children, I can usually handle it. It doesn't affect me because I've been hardened, but occasionally a story about a child will affect me, and it finds its way in and really just like skewers you, and you just go, oh, this is the human level of desperation and savagery that people experienced and what they saw and also when you hear a survivor story. A survivor story has a way of affecting filmmakers and viewers alike, and I think the survivor stories are important. And I'm involved in a project now to preserve and digitize 400 survivor testimonials. And you see from one account to the next, usually the person telling the story is not being emotional. They're remembering it like they're recounting it in a very monotone, unemotional way. Some people get emotional, but on the whole, survivors are not emotional. It's like they dealt with the emotion a long time ago, and almost in a way of somebody having post-traumatic stress. The only way that they can tell the story is to do it in a very straightforward, unemotional way. And I think that meeting survivors, in and of itself is, as a filmmaker, has been a blessing for me, because I think it's, you can't describe the feeling of a survivor telling you something which is so clear and so detailed in their memory. It's like they're seeing, it's like it happened yesterday.
That's right. And in the film, in fact, Serge's grandfather, a genocide survivor, is one of the subjects
Yes.
of the film. What was that like for you? What was that like for Serge?
Well, you know, I wasn't there when they recorded the central interview that was his testimonial. That was done by the family. And they initially couldn't find the tape. It was in, you know, a family member's garage, and they had to, you know, that's where I got into my bossy director's mode and said, find that tape.
That's right. Which is what you're doing now for the Showa Foundation. You're digitizing all of these incredible
really
interviews.
Important for people who, and this is just a sidebar, to anybody who's recorded a family member or relative. If you've recorded it on VHS or audio tape, that chances are that tape is decaying, and you've got to move it off that media and onto a digital
just
format.
mini DV even is archival.
Anything to get it off that media. It's really important to preserve it. But Serge's grandfather, I did meet in his convalescent home, and we had a short time with him. And just the day before, he had been very lucid, and he had been talking about his experiences, and he had been singing songs from the genocide. A lot of Armenians who were on the deportation marches, they sang songs, which a lot of them were coded messages about what they thought was happening and how they felt about what was going on. And these songs were folk songs that were remembered years later. And Serge's grandfather was singing these songs the day before we arrived. But when we got there, he had lapsed into a kind of dreamlike state almost. He remembered a few things, but he wasn't really sharp the day we saw him. So it was a missed opportunity. But luckily we had that family interview. And so we had his story.
Well, the LA Times has said that you document truth in dangerous places. And your films have gone on to win multiple awards. In our festival, you won the Armin T. Wegner Award. And Armin T. Wegner being, he was a diplomat who was there. His photographs are the very few documents that survive to this day that we have that show the genocide. And then you talk about working with Dr. Hakopian, who was an incredible man, and now you're digitizing his films.
Right.
I just feel like from one of these person transferred to Dr. Hakopian through to you, that we owe you a huge debt of gratitude for doing this work, Carla, and for having the courage and for sharing your film with us that we're going to now share with our audience on Horizon. Any closing words for your audience who may not have seen the film and are going to sit down to watch this intense documentary?
Well, thank you for saying that, and it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to show it. And I will say that those people who've heard about Screamers and are worried about the amount of heavy metal music, the first 12, 13 minutes of the film, it shows concert footage, and you might wonder, ooh, I don't know if I want to see the rest of this film. Hang in there. Yeah. Keep sitting it out, because it will become something you don't expect. And the music is the most appropriate way to mark the outrage and anger that we should all feel about these events. And even though it makes you feel uncomfortable and makes you wonder, why are they screaming and why are they swearing? What's that about? It is very appropriate to the subject matter, and we're lucky that System of a Down has lent their talent and their energy to the performance, which forms a central part of the film.
When watching this film and all of the different interview subjects, we come across Hrant Dink, which is one of the most amazing moments in the film. What was that like then? What is it like now, looking at the film and seeing this journalist in the prime of his life? There's a sparkle in his eye when he's being able to do what he does, which is talk about his culture and recognition.
Yes, it was actually the summer of 2005, and I interviewed him because he was friends with the author, the Turkish author, Orhan Pamuk.
That's right.
And Orhan Pamuk at that time was under pressure and in the spotlight, and the fear was that he would be attacked by extremists and that Orhan Pamuk would be the one who would get the assassin's bullet. And Hrant Dink, when I interviewed him, was himself being prosecuted in the Turkish court for insulting Turkishness. And that day he came in with a toothbrush, expecting that if he went to court and was found guilty, he'd have to go to prison. And he actually came to work with his toothbrush, which was a very strange thing to see.
He was ready.
He was ready. And he talked about how he was getting death threats on the telephone, and how you had to look over your shoulder when you leave the office. He was explaining this to me, And he found out that I was related to the author Rafi, the great author from the late 19th century. And when he heard that, he picked me up off the floor and just hugged me and took me through the office and introduced me to people and said, "Carla is the great niece of Rafi." And it was just a really happy memory I have of him. And then he said, "Come on, let's go to lunch." And he sent a friend ahead to the restaurant. And I later realized he sent a friend ahead to check out the street below and the entrance to the restaurant to make sure there was nobody threatening there. So that was July 2005, and then I saw him at our premiere in Los Angeles in November of 2006, and January 2007 he was shot dead. So it was in a very short period of time between seeing him and the murder, something like a couple of months.
Is there anything being done that you know of with his work? His publication, Ago. Well, I don't know if it was his publication, but he certainly wrote for it.
Well, he was the editor of the paper, and then his son became the editor, and there's the Hrant Dink Foundation, which is certainly trying to keep his legacy going, and there are some very dedicated new people working in Ago's newspaper in Istanbul, so despite the pressures, there are people who still believe in the cause and are working there. I think his memory it's still very strong in the Armenian community's minds, but I think it's very marked in the Turkish mind, and he was a very popular commentator in Turkey, and I think that his death left its mark. And even though time has passed, for those who are continuing to fight for democracy in Turkey and for a liberalization of civil rights, Hrant Dink's memory is still very strong.
And now you're, of course, working with the Shoah Foundation, which is digitizing the 400 interviews that Dr. Hakopian filmed of survivors of the genocide. And the organization is, of course, affiliated with Steven Spielberg.
That's right.
What is that like? What has that experience been like for you?
Well, I think it is our obligation and duty to make sure that all testimonials of Armenian genocide survivors and witnesses, because they're not all Armenians, there are witnesses who are not Armenian, the survivors and the witnesses are preserved, number one, and then shared with the world, because it's no good having a tape of a survivor sitting on a dusty shelf with nobody able to access that interview. The real power of those interviews will be when people all over the world, with a touch of a button, will be able to access through their computers those interviews.
That's right.
And furthermore, be able through search engines like a Google-type search engine to ask questions like, well, give me all males who came from Harper to ended up in Der Zor, and search words that you can combine and then pull down interviews that will take you to the minute of the interview where that survivor is speaking about those issues. That's the power of the Shoah Foundation archive, and which can be accessed by universities around the world. So what that means is, once we have the 400 interviews up there on the digital archive, universities around the world, you don't have to come to Southern California to look at these interviews. You'll be able to access them through the internet too, which is the university internet. You'll be able to access those interviews and see for yourself what Armenian survivors said about their experiences in 11 different languages. So English subtitles will be available, but you will hear the survivors speaking in their own languages, and I think that's really important.
He shot those on film, probably 16 millimeter.
All 16 millimeter film,
and
very high quality.
That's right. That's right, and I've seen some of the interviews in his films. They're incredible to watch. So they're being digitized, and what is that process like? What's the dollar amount, for example, that it costs to digitize each interview?
Well, because it's on film, it's a little more expensive, and the whole project from beginning to end, from the Armenian Film Foundation, who is digitizing it, it's going to cost us close to $400,000, and we've raised most of that. We're trying to just raise the finishing funds. On the Shoah side, they're going to be indexing and making each interview a kind of web page, so that not only will you hear the interview, you will be able to geographically go to a Google map and see the point on the map where the village was that the survivor came from, and how the names have changed over the years, because the Armenian village names don't exist as Armenian names now in Turkey. But you'll be able to see the name changes. You'll be able to see the deportation routes. And devising those web pages for each survivor and the keywords, that's what costs us. But once we establish the template, we'll be able to bring in other collections, not just this 400, other collections from around the world.
Amazing.
Including the Armenian Genocide Museum in Yerevan. They have about 100 interviews. So there are a number of collections. The Zoryan collection, they are looking at this the Spielberg collection and looking into the future, and possibly we will have access to the Zoryan collection, and there are other smaller collections. So it's very exciting. And I met Steven Spielberg in 2010, and I asked him, what do you think about the Turks who are going to come after you and say, what are you doing including Armenian genocides interviews in your digital archive? Are you prepared? Are you prepared for Turkish denialists? And he said, we know about them, and we're prepared.
Wow.
And he looked me in the eye. And that's very important. You have to look me in the eye.
That's right.
You have to do this. So Spielberg looked me in the eye. And the other thing he said, Alex, which I found very heartwarming, he said, I'm really impressed how every year Armenians come out and protest and commemorate. He said, every year you do that, and that's so impressive. I know we take it for granted that we do it, but for an outsider and such a legendary filmmaker to say that, I thought, isn't that interesting? That he's not Armenian, but he takes note of the fact that we commemorate. Right. So we have a very powerful ally now on our side, and I think when it comes to educating the world about the genocide, there's nothing more powerful than the testimonial of a survivor.
That's right. And of course, your film, Screamers. Now, where can the audience contact you if they want to find out more about the film? Is there a website?
Well, the website, screamersmovie.com, that's still available.
Great.
You can also reach me through the Armenian Film Foundation, which is armenianfilm.org. And that's also a good way to find out about the digitization project. And if anybody has a survivor interview, we will help you digitize that. It may not go into the Shoah archive, but we want to make sure you preserve it.
That's the Armenian Film Foundation.
The Armenian Film Foundation, Save Our Survivors, SOS.
Right.
Really important that we preserve these interviews and that they don't decay on audio tape and the old VHS tapes. Those tapes decay, and then that interview is lost forever.
Thank you so much, Carla, for joining us here on Film Dialogue. We're honored to have you. Keep up the great work, and we look forward to seeing your next project.
Thank you. And just as a little disclaimer or warning to the people about Screamers, it was rated R in the movie theaters, and it has a lot of rock music in the first 13 minutes of the film, but hang in there, you'll survive. You'll be a heavy metal fan at the end of it, and the documentary will unfold. So I look forward to all of you seeing it, and let me know what you think.